Good afternoon. My name is Jim Wilson, and I'm AgGateway Standards Director and SPADE Project Manager. The presentation today will be about AgGateway's SPADE project and related projects, and it's an overview presentation. Again, my name is Jim Wilson, and I'll be serving as facilitator. Our presenters today are Jeremy Wilson, Technology Specialist with Crop IMS, Joe Tevis, Director of Agronomic Products and Services with Topcon Precision Ag, and Dennis Daggett, Senior VP Strategic Initiatives with ProAg. And these gentlemen also serve in various AgGateway leadership roles, and I'll invite them to point that out when they first begin presenting on a topic. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dennis Daggett, who will provide a brief AgGateway overview. I realize that many of you have seen overviews before, but for those who haven't, this is just a couple slides to ground you. Dennis.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome, everybody. We'd just like to focus in real quickly on AgGateway, on our mission here for North America. And one of the things that we work on as our mission is to promote, enable, and expand e-business in agriculture. And on our next slide, we'll see that AgGateway is a North American, in North America, is a consortium of companies that work together in a nonprofit way, and that we recognize the value of standards, and especially in the information and communication technology arena. And what is missing in North America and is missing globally in agriculture is an organization dedicated to promoting its use in a standardized manner. And that's what AgGateway is doing. We've been working on that through the SPADE project. We've experienced steady growth and currently have over 230 member companies. And we do not actually work with any transactional data. But what we do look at is the data that is used across all segments of agriculture. In our next slide, we'll see that AgGateway has been involved in a number of projects. And within each one of the various councils, AgGateway has 8 councils that they take up projects to utilize standards or create standards, examine standards within e-business. And these are some of the projects that AgGateway has created, and many continue to even being worked on as today. If we take a look at the field operations, that's within the Precision Ag Council, and SPADE has worked on, which is your standardized Precision Ag Data Exchange, has worked on seeding operation, harvest operation, crop inputs, and irrigation. All of the projects you see here have been agreed to by the membership, and all of them are supported by volunteer activity, with oversight and project management being given by the AgGateway staff. And so the overall activity of AgGateway is as a consortium. It is as all companies working together for a common solution in e-business, and within that developing standards and guidelines for the transaction of e-business.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Now I'll hand it over to Joe Tevis, who will provide a SPADE overview, including the work being done within SPADE and the approach that we take to do the work. Joe?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, as it may be. My name is Joe Tevis, and talked a little bit about the SPADE overview. In 2012, AgGateway formed the Precision Ag Council. This council was unique in many ways, but perhaps the most significant was that it was the first council that touched the grower-customer directly. The first major project of the Precision Ag Council was SPADE, which is an acronym for Standardized Precision Ag Data Exchange. And I had the honor of chairing SPADE 1, as we called it, as well as SPADE 2. As with every project, the first important step was to find the project scope for SPADE. It was decided, and I think we click here, Jim, it was decided that for SPADE 1, we would be focusing on the seeding operations. The reason for this were a couple. First of all, seeding has become, and at that time was certainly well established as perhaps the most important field operation activity. That with the increasing cost of seed and the presence of GMOs, an accurate and complete operation of seeding was becoming more and more important. It was also one of the more complex operations, so we felt that as we grow the project SPADE to include other field operations, it would be easy to do so built on the seeding template itself. SPADE 2, as we'll talk about later, we'll go through these other scope include, and Jeremy Wilson will talk more about these in his section, but crop protection and the harvesting will be discussed later in SPADE 2. One more slide. We also needed to look at, define the scope in terms of the stakeholders. We knew that the FMIS, or Farm Management Information System, which is essentially office software, and the operator of that software, as well as the implement and operator of that implement, needed to be important stakeholders. So the farm management system would be in place to create tasks which are sent to the implement for execution, and then likewise the work record, if you will, sent back to the farm information system. We also discussed FMIS to FMIS transactions and decided that that also would be in the scope for the SPADE projects. Okay, next. The first project here, as we see an outline for this project, was contained a lot of different parts, is focused on seeding as I already identified. And the project itself was broken into 3 working groups, and these tasks were split among those working groups. The 3 working groups essentially worked in parallel, which proved to be not the best process, but after a few iterations, these tasks were completed, and these goals were met, and the original goals of SPADE 1 were met. Okay, next slide, please, Jim. SPADE 2, as I mentioned, we expanded to include reviewing of seeding use cases. We also included mechanical and non-mechanical harvest, as well as crop protection. So this added several more field operations to the scope, and all of which we dealt with in detail. We also introduced the concept of geopolitical context. And this is data that is country dependent, if you will, and in some cases even state dependent. So it would include things like government compliance reporting, crop assurance schemes such as we find in Europe, and so on. And the attempt was to abstract these parts of the model such that they could be easily adapted to other parts of the world. Now, most of the references, most of the examples that we give are North American examples, but we feel that they can be adapted to other parts of the world. And really, we'll find that out when we get more participation from members in Europe and so on and so forth. We also added one other component, and that's the last one in the bullet list there, and that's the SPADE conversion toolbox proof of concept. To explain what this is, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but essentially this is a software component that is designed to manage the complexity that we see in agriculture today, with many different file formats and many different ways of expressing the same information. As it turns out today, there are still a lot of legacy formats from each different OEM manufacturer. And that really complicates the task for the grower as well as the software developer. So the SPADE conversion toolbox was a attempt to simplify and manage some of this complexity. Okay, next slide, Jim. We also, at the beginning of SPADE 2, we conducted a lessons learned from SPADE 1, which was very revealing. And the outcome of that that process was the lessons learned process. It was a new project development process, roughly based on the agile system of development. Following the flow here, the project, all of our products within the project started with user stories. And these were very conversational, conducted and created by the domain experts, the non-technical people in the group. Once these stories are collected, then they are then translated into more formal descriptions of use cases, something that a programmer or a system architect could understand and relate to. After the use cases are developed, we then created what we've called the data buckets. In other words, for each of these use cases, what data is required to perform that operation or use case, and what data is collected during that operation or use cases. So this was, from my perspective, one of the more important steps, identifying all of the data requirements to execute the task, and also what data it needs to be recorded during the task. So this was done for each use case, for each of the products, as I mentioned. And the next step is, on the list here, is the ISO 11783 gap check. Now really this could be any standard, data standard that we will check against. In other words, we want to make sure that what we're doing is either already covered in an existing standard, or we will create an extension or an enhancement of that standard. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well later. Then the final step is to publish the results of that process. Also, in SPADE 2, we have amended to the original process flow a branch dedicated to the identification and access of common reference data. This includes identifying what reference data is required, and also defining potential sources for that data and standard APIs for accessing this data. We ourselves are not in the business of creating reference data. There's several people out there already doing that. So we just basically identify what those sources may be, and then also promote the publishing of standard APIs. And as I said, most of the examples, if you've read any of our work, are North American examples, but we've also made an effort to create these reference data APIs abstract enough so that other countries' reference data and can be added to this without much trouble. Okay, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Okay, now we're going to turn it over to Jeremy Wilson, who's going to walk you through a couple of examples of this process in action. I want to stress that that these examples and other examples that Joe and Dennis provide don't cover every aspect of what AgGateway does or what even the SPADE project does. They're just a couple of examples. So, Jeremy?
Okay, thank you, Jim. I'm Jeremy Wilson with Crop IMS, and I was the product owner for the mechanical harvest product of SPADE 2. And Joe kind of laid out the steps of how we develop this content and create the data standards that we're looking for. The first step in this process is creating these user stories. So in the case of mechanical harvest, we identified subject matter experts that helped us write a story or tell the story of cotton harvest, row crop harvest, which would be your corn and other row crops, a platform head type of harvest, which would be our soybeans and wheat and other platform harvested crops, potato harvest, forage harvest, and sugar beets. And we just took all those user stories and took a tremendous amount of time actually talking to these subject matter experts and just trying to actually determine what happened out there in the field when these different crops were harvested. We also addressed this on the non-mechanical side as well to complete the whole harvest use case, but I'm just going to focus on the mechanical. So after we have these user stories collected, then we move into the next slide that talks about how we develop the business business project diagrams and how the data flows and the different actors that are involved in this harvest process. And this is probably the second most time-consuming piece that we do, is we talk about what needs to happen and who are the people that needs to interact with this data that we're trying to standardize. And so the example that's on your screen is actually I believe it's a cotton harvest. So we talk about the things that need to happen. So, you know, the top is the grower, and this is things that will happen in his FMIS, or his farm management information system, that could be in his own home office. And we talk about different things that need to be collected and sent out to the other actors. We developed a set of core documents that was on one of the slides that Joe had up, but we defined a plan, recommendation, work order, work record, and then a machine setup file. And so we talk about how we use each of these core documents through the process. So in that top swim lane, we talk about that machine setup file to the MICS. So that would be that machine reference data. Then we have a work order created, which would be a somewhat similar to like a task file or a job to be sent to the MICS. And this flow talks about how we need to communicate that work order to a number of different actors in this system. And so that helps us identify new pieces of information that needs to be standardized, so that then we can move it through the process and get to the ISO gap analysis. Next slide, Jim. So once we have these business modeling processes diagrams done, we then take that and develop the technical use case. And these are just traditional use cases that developers could use to understand that harvest process. And in SPADE 2, we documented most everything that we had the user stories from. So we come to realize we needed to have a couple different use cases as it relates to cotton. You know, we have the onboard baling attachment now with some of the pickers here in North America. We have traditional modules. We found that forage harvest also needed to be addressed in a couple different use cases. One, if that was going to be ensiled or chopped through a traditional forage chopper, or if it's going to go into a bale. And then we identified the row crop harvest use case, the platform, and then we kind of called the sugar beets more of a lifting crop, because we identified we had other crops besides just sugar beets that use that same type of process of lifting that crop and then picking it up. From there, we move into the next slide, which talks about the data bucket documentation. And this is where we take all of the use cases and we take the BPMN diagrams, or the business process flow, and identify what is that key data that has to be communicated now that we completely understand the use cases. And we initially started off with 4 separate data bucket documents of sorts. So we identified one for forage harvest. We called one just mechanical harvest that took in the row crop heads, the platform style heads, and a few others. We also had the lifting crops, which your sugar beets and potatoes kind of went into that. And then we also had the machine reference data. And from that, now we have kind of progressed through that, and we've kind of combined that into one big document that is used now as our whole data bucket document of sorts from SPADE 2. And if we move on to the next slide, Jim, we've kind of give you a little excerpt of a snippet of what that looks like. You know, we've got categories and how we've categorized that data. I'm not going to go into great detail on that, but we did specify, you know, things that might need to be in a work order and what is required, what would be optional, things that might be added to the work order once it was loaded or brought into an MICS or field computer. And we kind of break that down and have now determined that, you know, we're going to require the client, farm, and field, which will be mandatory in that work order. And then at the far right in that grid, you can see we identify where that is in the ISO spec. And if there is deficiencies there and ISO that doesn't meet the requirement, we have proposed some new DDIs and some new extensions. And as you can see, we've got near the bottom there, we got one that says is missing, and that is a time where we would figure out whether that's an extension, whether that's something we do through a SPADE extension, which is our own set of extensions just for the SPADE project. And now the last part of this process on the next slide, Jim, is where we actually publish that. So we go and out of SPADE 2, we will be publishing the user stories, the use cases, all the data bucket documents, and the ISO gap analysis that we've done. That will all be published information that can be used as a resource to members of the company. In SPADE 3, that I'll talk about a little later here in the presentation, we're actually going to move into the implementation of this content that we've created through SPADE 2. Actually, I am on tap to talk about PALE. PALE is another project like SPADE 2 and 3 that we've had in the Precision Ag Council. PALE is the Precision Agriculture Irrigation Leadership. Next slide, Jim. And PALE is kind of the irrigation specific sister project to what SPADE is. We were focused on developing the common data formats and delivering a set of schemas to be able to communicate important information about irrigation. We've worked through ASABE towards a national/international standard was one of the goals, and the two main avenues that we've focused on and worked on in PALE would be off-site and plus inbound data. So that could be things like water content and weather sensors, and then the as-applied data, and that's what the application really happened out in the field. If we move to the next slide, we've kind of developed a diagram of sorts that explains how this process works and what we intended to accomplish. This is a little bit of a busy slide, and there's a lot going on. The key thing to focus in on here is as we talk about recommendations and how we send those prescriptions and how we get it to the actual controller on each of the pivots. All of the green arrows on the screen is content that the PALE project has and standards that we've developed to communicate that data. All of the red arrows would be proprietary formats that pivot manufacturers are going to maintain themselves. So there's pieces of this that was well in scope and needed standardized and be able to communicate, but we also identified that there was some proprietary things there that manufacturers needed to maintain for proper operation of their equipment. And now, Jim, I'll pass it back to you because we move into ADAPT.
Yeah, actually, we'll move forward. Joe, if you could cover this quickly, as we know Dennis has an appointment he needs to move on to.
I'll do it quickly. I mentioned before a proof of concept called Conversion Toolbox, and that was a software project to manage complexity of various legacy formats. The proof in that project was actually obtained in a AEF Plug Fest where we participated, which was held in Lincoln, Nebraska in May of 2014. Based on those positive results, AgGateway decided to promote and separate that project and move it into a full-scale working group called ADAPT, Ag Data Application Programming Toolkit. So this is an ongoing project right now. We have a business committee led by Mark Relford, and as well as a technical group. So this is an ongoing project today, and we are actively looking for participants. We're in the model development stage, have not begun a lot of programming yet, but this is something that we'll be discussing with AEF in the next Plug Fest in May as well. The goals are, as we have on the screen there, essentially they're to, as I said, manage the complexity both for the user and for the software developer of all of these various file formats. There'll be two parts. There'll be a basic component part, which we will develop, and then we will be asking OEM manufacturers to create software plugins to handle their own specific data. Okay, Jim. That, I'll pass it on to Dennis then.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Joe. And if you're interested in ADAPT, I would be happy to arrange a webinar for any of the participants. Just shoot me an email. Okay. So the next topic is I'm going to pass the baton back to Dennis, who's going to discuss with us the geopolitical context and regulatory reporting and perhaps glossary.
Yeah.
So Dennis?
Thank you, Jim. And the geopolitical context that we're working here with is that basically we understand that all of our standardization work that we do within AgGateway, within all of our projects, requires that the regulatory environment be actually acknowledged and understood. And the geopolitical context will occur in three categories, which is process, industry segment, and geopolitical. And we actually understand that in many ways, the default standard maker is going to be a regulatory agency or a government. And so in our next slide there, you'll see what's these three categories, sorry, Jim, that were there and how they actually work here. That, yeah. And what we've done here to actually work on our, in this geopolitical environment is actually take a look at regulatory reporting. And so what we've done is we follow the same process that we have done before, that Jeremy and that Joe have actually identified. We build user stories. We primarily focused in on the USDA, on their user story. We created then those user stories. On our next slide, we'll see that from that, we actually built specific use cases, specifically on the Risk Management Agency, which is crop insurance, the Farm Service Agency, which is your government programs, support programs, and down to the state level, even on California pesticide reporting. From that, then we go to our next slide, we take a look at that we've actually identified through the use cases our data buckets that we use on that. In our next slide, what we've looked at here is that we try to identify these data buckets and identify the data item and the description. And again, these are actually defined by the regulator themselves. And so that's what we try to identify, make sure that everything that we're working with can be used within a regulatory reporting environment. On our next slide, you'll actually see we don't have any ISO standard. And so that's when we go to the ADAPT object model, because the data here is not really very compatible with the ISO standards because of the regulatory environment. It is data that would reside within the FMIS, but it is usually specific to the nation or to the state or to a jurisdiction. And so instead of trying to include these extensions in the ISO standard, we actually introduce them into the ADAPT model. And that's where we work with that there on the ADAPT model. On our next slide, you'll see that the focus of that is this context item object. And with that, we actually work on defining that. So we do implement regulatory data as a set of nested name value unit measured tuples, and that within that it's given a GPCT type code, and these objects are actually nested. So from that, we define what the regulator wants, and it's within this context, within ADAPT, that we can actually push and pull that data back and forth and do so in conjunction and actually coordinated even with ISO, but within the actual SPADE project itself. On our next slide, to do that, we actually have to have a standardized glossary. The glossary has been very needed, and so we created a comprehensive ag glossary there, and it has a specific purpose, which is to develop a one-stop location on the wiki itself for ag terms, definition, acronyms, keywords, synonyms that all of agriculture can use, specifically to support accurate communication. And so there's an interplay between the glossary and the geopolitical context reporting requirements. On our next slide, you'll see that in the glossary, to make it really functional, we built it as an ontological glossary. And the reason we went through an ontological glossary is actually to establish the authority, value, and the accuracy of the term. And so therefore, the glossary will have strong credibility no matter where it's being used. And it's focused in on primary terms and then contextual terms. And so if you go into the glossary and you go to agglossary.org, which is at the top of your slide there, you can actually see this function, this ontological function, working, and you can then actually identify the priority value of that term. On your next slide, we are actually working with a number of groups right now to get the terms and definitions actually included in into the glossary. We've actually reached out and are currently working with ASABE, with the USDA. On tap, we want to work with AEF, ISO, and AEM on that, and we are collectively working on placing those terms in there. We do so through a permission to use letter, which allows the contributing organization to control the term and the definition. And it goes through a glossary working group that actually works on placing that term into the glossary, and we've placed a priority on placing legal and standards terms into the glossary right now, and that's what we have done. On our next slide, there, yeah, we have how everybody can actually work on the contribution of terms. We do it internally within AgGateway with all the councils and the projects, which you've seen before. And the purpose of our working group is to actually establish a process for proper maintenance and development of the glossary. We actually work on the classification and establishing the authority value of that. We make sure that all the terms and definitions are credible and accurate, and we maintain public access so everyone has access to the glossary. So you can go to the agglossary.org right now and take a look at it and look at how it's structured. And then that is used within all the projects, within all the regulatory reporting, within all of the various work that we've done on standardization. Jim, back to you.
Okay, great, Dennis. Really appreciate your comments there. And Dennis needs to run now for another appointment. Before we transition to the next topic, I just want to remind everyone on the call that you are welcome to submit questions. We have one question already submitted, and we'll address that at the end of the presentation, but we welcome other questions. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to collaboration, and back to Joe Tevis.
Thank you, Jim. AgGateway does not operate in a vacuum, of course. We understand and appreciate the fact that there are many other industry groups and standard groups working hard to achieve similar goals, and AgGateway has no interest in replacing or repeating the work done by these other groups. For that reason, an important part of every project is the identification of other standards groups that our work may touch and overlap, and also to actively reach out to these groups and identify how and what type of cooperation would be possible. And so far, this approach has been very rewarding. An example is our cooperation with AEF and ISO 11783. Many of our AgGateway and SPADE members, including myself, serve on multiple standards committees. And I personally serve on 2 ISO committees, as others do as well. And as Jeremy identified earlier, that as we identify gaps in these standards, being already serving on them makes it very easy for us to recommend additions or enhancements to these standards, which has happened several times already. The slide that Jim is showing you now is a complete slide of all of the various standards groups for which AgGateway has some sort of an association. So there's very many, quite a few of them there, and ISO 11783 is only one of those many standards groups. So this is, as I said, an active part of every project. Identify other standards groups, figure out what the touch points are between our work and theirs, and identify how best we can cooperate with that group.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Okay, so our next topic, we go back to Jeremy to wrap up the conversation. He's going to tell you a little bit about our upcoming project, SPADE 3.
Thank you, Jim. And I did forget to mention, my role within AgGateway is I served as vice chair of the SPADE 2 project, and now will be chairing SPADE 3, which is now out for charter and consideration. Actually, the Precision Ag Council has a meeting tomorrow morning to vote on this specific charter to move forward with the next phase of SPADE 3. SPADE 3, given that our charter is approved tomorrow, we'll kick this off at the AgGateway annual mid-year meeting in Altoona, Iowa on June 8th with a face-to-face meeting. And our task that our deliverables or task of SPADE 3 will be to focus on documentations and resources needed to implement the work we've done in SPADE 1 and SPADE 2. We're also going to look at the crop nutrition use cases and data buckets, and we'll take it through the whole process that we've explained a couple times now. Scouting use cases and user stories, we're going to try to identify that scouting process, which is agronomic scouting. Continue the reference data work to get a reference data directory catalog of sorts for all this other reference data that's not available today. We're also going to kick off almost a sub-project of sorts called WAVE, which is the Wireless Asset and Vehicle Data Exchange, and that's going to talk about being able to wirelessly transfer data primarily from the cloud back into an FMIS, and how you take data from an FMIS and get it to the cloud to go to machine. Also, we're going to coordinate more with Pale, CART, and ADAPT. Actually, CART, which is the commodity automation of rail and truck movement, grain movement, will be part of our charter now, and we'll be working at identifying how to tie in another standard, which is the kind of the AgXML standard of how we move grain. And that'll all be accomplished hopefully in SPADE 3 if the charter is approved tomorrow. Next slide, Jim. We're very eager and would be very interested in working with your group in Europe, in AgGateway Europe. As we understand it, you're preparing to launch a SPADE-like project, and we're very mindful of the global applicability of that work, and we'll be eager to coordinate, with your group to, to learn about the European precision ag requirements, and when requested, would be more than willing to have another call like this to explain our work to AgGateway Europe as you begin to, head down this path that we've been on as well. And I'll take this time to thank all of you that's taken the time to listen to it, and turn it back to Jim.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so at this point, we're ready for questions. And again, I would encourage you to either raise your hand or just post your question in the control panel. So currently we have one question, and that question is the ISO 11783-10 extension proposal already available? And the answer is yes, and I think I should be able to show you that. So if you go to the AgGateway website, and then I believe it's under standards. Actually, I should probably have planned this in advance. So yeah, I don't think this was such a good idea, actually. Yeah, we do have it posted on our website. Oh, here we go. So I'm sorry, it's under guidelines here. So you can see, so under e-connectivity, guidelines, and then the first entry here in this list is ISO 11783-10 ISO XML extensions draft. And we call it draft because we invite public comment. It's really not for us to publish, and it's not technically an ISO draft. It's just what we submitted to ISO in coordination with AEF. Joe, is there anything you want to add to that?
Is that on the public site right there, Jim?
It is, yep.
Okay.
It's publicly available to anybody.
Yeah, that document is pretty extensive, and that has been submitted to the ISO Part 10 committee. Quite frankly, some of the elements in that proposal do fit into what they define as their scope, and some do not. So the elements that do not fit within their defined scope will be added to a SPADE extensions document and managed separately from the ISO. So, but that is in all its glory available for viewing.
Right, very exciting. So those of you interested, download it, take a look at it. Okay, I don't see any other questions posted in the control panel. We will be offering another presentation on Tuesday, and the plan currently is that it will be a repeat of this presentation. We welcome your comments. If there's any way we can improve this presentation for the one we do next, we'd appreciate your input on that. Also, if there are any topics you would like to drill down on, for example, the PALE project, or if you'd like to learn more about ADAPT, we have, Joe did a great job explaining that, but we have other people who would be delighted to drill down on that, both from a business perspective and a technical perspective, if you want to learn more about that. So just email me at jim.wilson@aggatewayglobal.net, or just respond to any of the emails that you've received from AgGateway Global Network, and we'll schedule those webinars. So with that, I just want to wrap up by thanking our panelists, Joe Tevis with Topcon, Dennis Daggett with ProAg, and Jeremy Wilson with Crop IMS. And then thank you all for attending. And with that, we are complete. Take care. Bye.